Hello and welcome to The Next 6 Months with me, Peter Cox, and far more importantly, Mark Thomas, business guru, strategist, consultant, all-round good guy actually, and mathematical near genius. I'm not qualified, Mark, but I think you probably are pretty close to genius level in maths. I've been looking at the news this week. There's been an awful lot of it. Some of it's really quite disturbing. So I thought we might talk through some of the headlines today and get your comments on them. Big news economically in the UK is this chap who is in charge of the UK economy, basically. We give him the recondite name of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he's just done what I think is a budget, but it wasn't called that, was it, Mark?
It was called a spending review, but effectively it's a similar thing. He set out where he intends to spend and where he intends to cut.
Right. Okay. So he's done that, and there've been no end of headlines appearing. Here's one. Be scared. Be very, very scared. It's going to cost each household £16,000, and we want your money now. That's one headline. Another one, same newspaper. The Chancellor refuses to say how he's going to pay for all the COVID borrowing he's had to incur. Enormous telephone numbers here, £46 billion in tax rises. This is very bad news, isn't it? Actually, we're looking as if we're a bankrupt country.
Well, I mean, it's very bad news that they write headlines like that because, as you say, it absolutely gives the impression that the UK is on the verge of bankruptcy. I think one of those headlines used the word catastrophe. Yeah. Now, I don't know if you remember, we showed a chart a few days ago in one of the earlier sessions where we looked at the history of UK debt over the last 300 years.
I do remember that, yeah.
We could see that in the last few years it has gone up a lot, and it will probably go up a lot in the next couple of years, but it won't go up very far above the average level for where it's been over the last 300 years.
But,
so
I'm sorry, you can't go against the Daily Mail here, Mark. I mean, look, the pain has only just begun, they're saying. It's going to scar the economy. At least until the end of year after next. I mean, who's right?
Well, now there's a really good question about whether it will scar the economy, but that's a completely different question from the state of government finances. Okay. So scarring the economy would be damaging the real economy, people and businesses. So if, for example, if a lot of businesses go bankrupt between now and the middle of next year, you can't just set up an equivalent number of businesses at the same rate in 6 months. In other words, they can collapse much faster than they can grow again. So that is sort of semi-permanent damage to the economy. That's scarring. Right. So if we get a lot of businesses collapsing, that's scarring. If we get a lot of households going bankrupt, that's scarring because, again, it takes a long time for a household to rebuild its finances. And people who are bankrupt can't spend, they can't support their local businesses, they can't support any businesses, actually, with their spending. So that's scarring. So what he should really be focusing on is avoiding scarring. And that means actually he needs not to be afraid to spend. He needs to be prepared to spend to protect against scarring. So
he's not going to do
I agree
that.
With.
Yeah. Go on.
No, I don't think he is going to do that. He had previously said that he wouldn't. He made a speech where he said, I can't protect every business, I can't protect every job, no chancellor could. This time round, he did say that was his number one priority, but it doesn't actually look as though he's done that.
No. Well, I've got another cutting, you see. I mean, the news has been helter-skelter this week. Here's another cutting. I think it's today's, actually, Daily Mail. And the Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, who we've alluded to before, his Thatcher moment, he's echoing the Iron Lady, who memorably, of course, said there's no such thing as society. So he's kind of redefining or defining the role of government and what it can do in our lives and what it can't do. Explain that to us, please, Mark.
Well, exactly. So there are some people who believe that governments are an important part of a successful society. And if you look at actually the most successful countries in the world, as we did the other day, we see that they have they run a very balanced economy, actually, where they have a strong private sector, but they also have a very active and, by comparison with us, a very large public sector. So they run a balanced economy. What this is getting at is the market fundamentalist idea, which says really the state should be as small as possible. The state shouldn't be doing anything. So Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society. There are only men and women and families. The implication of that is, if you want somebody to look after you, then it's got to be yourself and your family, because there's no such thing as society. Society isn't going to do it. Now, that's completely different from the post-war social contract. We talked about what happened during the war, when Sir William Beveridge was commissioned to write a report in 1942 to give Britain something to hope for, a better world after the war. And he produced the Beveridge Report, and the Beveridge Report was then implemented after the war by Clement Attlee's government. And the point of that was to protect, was that there was such a thing as society. Beveridge was very clear: men and women and families have responsibilities and duties, but so does society, so does the government. And that's when the welfare state was set up. That's when the NHS was set up. So the reason that if I get cancer today, I don't have to worry about getting a £30,000 bill is because of that social contract.
I think you can add a zero to that, actually, Mark.
I probably can. I'm not an expert in the cost of these things. But, in America, the number one cause of domestic bankruptcies is healthcare bills, because people get these diseases. And, if it's your life or your house, you basically sell your house in order to pay for your medical treatment, and then you're homeless. Now, that's what happens if you go into a world where you say there's no such thing as society, or, as Sunak was saying, government sort of sets the direction, but it's down to families and people to actually do everything. So that is the market fundamentalist. So I agree with the headline. He's echoing that market fundamentalist position, which Margaret Thatcher really first introduced. It's the individual and the family and the community. So that means you might get something from charity if you fall on really hard times.
Or food banks. I'm seeing in central London, Mark, I can't believe it. You go out for a walk and you see food banks, and people are getting food there because they haven't got any money for food. And we're not even into the winter yet. It's extraordinary.
No, absolutely. And people are denying that this is poverty. They call it food poverty, as though there's some other reason for not buying food than that you haven't got enough money. It's basically poverty, and it's becoming widespread. So we've talked a lot about mass impoverishment. And if you believe that the government isn't the solution, then it has to be things like food banks that are the solution. I don't know if you remember, Therese Coffey was asked a question in Parliament about food banks, and she said, well, I believe actually they're a perfect solution to the problem. We've got an article about it on the website called The Morality of Food Banks. If you are a true market fundamentalist, that's how you look at it. That's why Jacob Rees-Mogg said he thought it was rather uplifting to see the growth in food banks, because this is basically people who are not being fed with taxpayers' money. They're being fed by charity. And unfortunately, some of these people think this is the way to go. So that is the fundamental ideological difference between those market fundamentalists and most normal people who think that if you're a citizen of this country, you do have a right to some basics like healthcare, and if you fall on hard times, you should be able to draw unemployment benefit, and you should not have to go begging in the street, basically.
Yes. Yeah, I actually think that an awful lot of people, maybe the majority of people, don't really understand that we are in the hands of absolute fundamentalists here, and every day
I think you're right. Yeah, exactly, because they've been very, very clever. They didn't set up a party called the Market Fundamentalist Party. They took over a hugely successful vote-winning machine, which was the Conservative Party. And they didn't change the name. They didn't say, we're not conservative, we're radical, we're not unionist, we don't care what happens to the United Kingdom. They kept the name, the Conservative and Unionist Party, and they still talk about one nation values. But of course, if you look at what they're actually doing, you can see that what they're doing is following the market fundamentalist line, and more what they say gives clues away. And if you look at some of the books that some of them have written, it's very clear what they think of normal people.
Well, you've done the research. You've done the research. Yeah. Sorry, go on. No, this is fascinating.
Well, I was just going to say there was a book which was written by Priti Patel and a few others. I've forgotten.
She wrote a book.
And
I'm amazed.
It might have been the others that wrote it, but she had her name on the cover with the others. And one of the things that this book claims is that British workers are amongst the laziest in the world. It said something like, the British worker, once he enters the workplace, is amongst the world's greatest idlers. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever for that, but that's the mindset that they have. So you have
She's an all-round horrible person, actually, isn't she? I mean, Johnson won't get rid of her because of these bullying.
She wasn't the only one that wrote it, as you point out. It's a lot of them, but the image they have is that poor people are just not pulling up their socks. They're just not contributing to society, and rich people are working very long hours managing their hedge funds and doing all the things they do, which is true. Actually, it's hard work running a hedge fund.
Sure it is.
And all the bottom half of the population is basically just full of sponges who will, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And if that's your attitude, then you do want to be doing all of these things. You want to be freezing benefits and pushing people off benefit into food banks and all that sort of thing.
Absolutely miserable. You'll be delighted to know that the Daily Mail is not my sole source of news, especially this week. And there's another newspaper north of the border here in Scotland that's got a rather different headline. Obviously Maradona. Yeah, we can't get away from that, nor should we. But their main news headline, BBC accused of defending Tory austerity. Now, you don't often read that in an English newspaper. What's going on?
Well, no, you don't read it at all. I mean, we've seen that's a stark contrast with what the Mail was saying.
Yeah, it is.
And indeed what most other English media are saying. So the twaddle and the economic illiteracy, I think what they're talking about is this constant comparison between the state of government finances and the way a household works. And a pretense that a government should run itself in the same way as a household should. And we talked a little bit about that a few days ago.
Yeah,
and some of the big differences. So the biggest difference between me and my household and the government is that I'm not allowed to create money. The government is allowed to create money via the Bank of England, or in theory, it could just get the Royal Mint to print a few $1 trillion notes if it wanted to, but the Bank of England does it electronically, so it's very easy. It's just the touch of a keystroke. So the Bank of England, since the global financial crisis, has now created well over £750 billion, and is on its way by the end of this year to have created £1 trillion worth of money out of nothing, which is used to buy government bonds. In other words, it supports government borrowing.
Okay.
And it could be just used for spending. There's no reason at all why it has to go through that route of buying government bonds. It could just literally be used for spending.
So when we see headlines like this from our dear friend Mr. Alex Brummer in the Mail, saying that each household has got a bill coming up for £16,000, technically speaking, as an economist, Mark, what's the technical expression for this kind of stuff?
Twaddle, as
twaddle.
Okay,
right. Thank you.
Yes. The Scottish headline. The Scottish headline called it "Twaddle and the Economic Illiteracy," and it's hard for me to improve on headline writers, so I'm just going to plagiarise. There you are. Slammed for talking twaddle as the corporation promotes economic illiteracy. But of course, the worrying thing is it's not just the corporation; it is all these newspapers as well. So most people in England are surrounded by this twaddle, and of course they believe it. But if you think about it, if a government is nothing like a household, which it really isn't for many reasons, including the one I've just mentioned, then this is very, very dangerous, because what it means is that people panic, and you can see that they're being encouraged to panic when words like catastrophe are used, or Armageddon I've seen in places.
Yeah,
so we're being encouraged to panic, so that when they turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, but, do you really want to bankrupt the country? We've got to make more cuts. People will say, well, regrettably, no, I don't want to make more cuts. But of course, if that's the situation, we have to do it. Now, if we were at war, in the Second World War, nobody said, well, hang on a minute, our debt's never been this high. And in the Second World War, it would actually have been true at times. It had never in history been as high. It's not true now, despite what people are saying, but it was true during the Second World War. If people had said, look, I'm sorry, but we just can't go on borrowing money at this rate. We're just going to have to surrender. Nobody would have said, well, hang on a minute, we are not going to surrender. We can win this war. We in the Second World War. That was at the time when Maynard Keynes was one of the foremost economists, and he was famous for saying, well, anything we can actually do, we can afford. And of course, when it comes to winning a war, governments remember that, because they want to win the war, and they remember they can afford it. And we've seen the same thing with COVID. Actually, the last few months, the government has spent an enormous amount, because when it comes to the crunch, it remembers that anything we can actually do, we can afford. But some governments want to forget that as quickly as possible. And the way to forget it, especially when the evidence is all around us, because of what's been happening in the last few months, is to have headlines like these that tell us, no, we must stop this as a matter of urgency. So thank heavens for the Scottish newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely. Wish I could get a Scottish passport right now, actually.
Yes.
Thank you,
you may
Mark.
need one soon.
I think I will, actually. Yes, if this winter looks in any way, shape or form the sort of dreadful time that it possibly is going to be. We've got a lot of news this week. As you will know, if you've been looking at the British papers, British news, there's been a leaked report from the government that is causing everybody some consternation. We're going to be asking Mark about that, to have a good look at that analytically tomorrow. So please spread the word. Leave a comment or question for Mark right here on YouTube in the comment section. And we'll see you tomorrow.